The Cuban Missile Crisis, 13 Days of Peril. The Cuban Missile Crisis, a 13-day standoff between the United States and Soviet Union, was sparked by the Soviet decision to install nuclear missiles in Cuba. This decision was the result of aggressive U.S. foreign policy in 1961 that ultimately convinced the Soviet Union that missiles in Cuba were a necessity. However, a dedication to nuclear deterrence forced both President John F. Kennedy and Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev into accepting a compromise that would pull the two superpowers back from the brink of nuclear war. In December 1956, Fidel Castro and a group of followers landed on the island of Cuba to overthrow dictator Fulgencio Batista. Since Batista first came to power in 1933, the United States government had backed his regime despite rampant corruption, human rights abuses, and overall government inefficiency. Public support for Castro grew, and on January 1, 1959, Batista fled the country, and Castro established himself as the new leader of Cuba. The Cuban Revolution marked the beginning of U.S. aggression towards Cuba, due to Castro's leftist ideologies, which the United States would not tolerate. Upon assuming the presidency in January 1961, John F. Kennedy began an aggressive foreign policy agenda aimed at limiting the spread of communism. In April of 1961, the Central Intelligence Agency used a plan left over from the Eisenhower administration and began to train exiled Cubans for an invasion of Cuba to overthrow Castro. The Bay of Pigs invasion, as it became known, was a resounding failure that deeply scarred U.S.-Cuban relations. In June that same year, the United States began deploying Jupiter missiles to Turkey. Soviet officials claimed these missiles were designed to provoke rather than promote collective security. The Soviets weren't far off. The missiles' role was to deliver a devastating first strike against them. Finally, in November 1961, the United States launched Operation Mongoose, another covert operation targeting the Castro regime. Kennedy believed he was taking actions to protect the security of the Western Hemisphere. Khrushchev believed the operation was in preparation for war on a Soviet ally.
So Operation Mongoose really had a huge negative effect on Cuban-U.S. relations because Khrushchev and Castro both saw the operation paired alongside U.S. military maneuvers in the Gulf of Mexico and in the Caribbean as potential build-up for an actual invasion of Cuba following the failed Bay of Pigs invasion. This sort of backed both Castro and Khrushchev in a corner and was one of the leading factors as to why Khrushchev felt that nuclear missiles were the only real way to keep the United States out of Cuba.
The final influence on Khrushchev's decision to install missiles in Cuba was America's nuclear supremacy. The U.S. military far surpassed the Soviets in terms of both quality and quantity of nuclear weapons. In 1962, the United States nuclear stockpile consisted of roughly 3,500 warheads, over 6 times that of the Soviet Union. Nikita Khrushchev, the first secretary of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union and leader of the USSR, decided that Soviet missiles stationed in Cuba would be necessary to protect Cuban sovereignty and remedy the nuclear imbalance. In May of 1962, a secret Soviet delegation convinced Cuban Defense Minister Raúl Castro to accept Soviet missiles. The plan, known as Operation Anadir, was to install nuclear-capable SS-4 and SS-5 surface-to-surface missiles in Cuba. By October of 1962, 42,000 Soviet personnel had landed in Cuba, and the missiles were being made operational. The missile sites quickly became difficult to hide. Suspicious of Soviet action in Cuba, the United States began U-2 reconnaissance flights of the island in August of 1962. The planes were capable of taking 1,000 photographs in under 10 minutes as they flew over the heart of the island. On October 14th, a U-2 aircraft manned by Richard Heiser photographed the San Cristobal area, one of the first missile launch site locations. This provided U.S. intelligence the first concrete evidence of Soviet missiles stationed in Cuba. On October 15th, the CIA confirmed what the photographs suggested, and the next day President Kennedy was informed of the missiles' existence. Upon learning of the missiles, Kennedy assembled his cabinet and top advisors to discuss possible responses. The Executive Committee of the National Security Council, or EXCOM for short, consisted of several members including the President, Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara,
Director of Central Intelligence John McCone, and Special Assistant McGeorge Bundy. Allowing the missiles to remain in Cuba was never an option for the committee. John F. Kennedy was viewed as a Cold Warrior president. Kennedy believed that if the U.S. allowed missiles in Cuba, the Soviet Union would only continue more aggressive policies. Whether the Soviets deployed the missiles to protect an ally or provoke the U.S. was irrelevant. ExComm members agreed that leaving the missiles would weaken America's credibility in the face of allies and adversaries alike. The committee presented a broad range of political opinion. On one end of the spectrum was military intervention. General Maxwell Taylor believed the crisis to be a test of wills, with the most definitive course of action being an airstrike against all known missile sites. Taylor further suggested that the airstrike be followed by a U.S.-led invasion of Cuba to overthrow Castro and dismantle any further launch sites. The plan would undeniably lead to the death of Soviet troops and prompt a Soviet invasion in another part of the world, probably West Berlin. Although this was the quickest path to war, the generals hoped cooler heads would prevail before nuclear weapons were considered. This policy of brinkmanship was not uncommon during the Cold War. By pushing an enemy to the brink of war, the enemy either backed down or was forced to escalate.
Those less receptive to the idea of military confrontation proposed the idea of issuing a naval blockade around Cuba to prevent further militarization. Ships bound for Cuba would be checked, and, if found to hold offensive weaponry, be turned back. However, many believed this action would only delay the inevitable and allow Cuba time to develop operational missiles.
Now, what made the blockade so controversial was not that it was a non-military option, but that it would be seen by the international community as everything Khrushchev had feared with Operation Mongoose and Kennedy's big talk on nuclear weapons. He would have seen the blockade as the first step towards an actual invasion of Cuba, a blatant act of war against the communist country, and much of ExComm feared that this would spark a nuclear retaliation.
On the other end of the spectrum was UN Ambassador Adlai Stevenson, who believed diplomacy was the only way to de-escalate the crisis. Stevenson proposed an agreement where the U.S. withdrew its Jupiter missiles from Turkey, and the Soviets withdrew their missiles from Cuba. While diplomacy seemed to offer a peaceful resolution to the conflict, the exchange was the most unpopular idea presented in the ExComm meetings. General Taylor believed that the Soviets could not be trusted and that diplomacy offered no permanent solution, whereas an invasion could overthrow Castro and install a U.S.-friendly leader. Others were wary of the political ramifications if missiles were removed from a NATO ally for America's own protection. On October 16th, ExComm decided to reject an airstrike against the missile sites and instead opted to go with a naval blockade of Cuba. In the following days, the U.S. raised its defense readiness level to DEFCON 2. For the only time in U.S. history, B-52 bombers went on continuous airborne alert. Roughly 150 intercontinental ballistic missiles stood ready to be fired. On October 27th, Major Rudolph Anderson's aircraft was shot down over Cuban territory, resulting in his death. The United States and Soviet Union rested on the brink of war. Kennedy's closest military advisors continued to call for a U.S. invasion of Cuba. However, Kennedy refused. He understood that such an invasion would trigger Soviet aggression in Berlin, forcing NATO to respond. Both leaders understood direct conflict would quickly devolve into nuclear warfare, which made compromise absolutely necessary. On the night of the 27th, Robert Kennedy met secretly with Soviet Ambassador Anatoly Dobrynin, promising the private removal of missiles from Turkey if the Soviet Union publicly removed its missiles from Cuba. The U.S. would also agree to respect Cuban sovereignty and terminate any plans for Castro's removal. The next morning, on October 28th, Premier Khrushchev publicly announced his intention to dismantle and remove the missiles from Cuba, ending the conflict quicker than it had begun and diffusing perhaps the most dangerous crisis in the history of the world. Although it was John F. Kennedy's aggressive foreign policy that prompted the Soviets' decision to install missiles in Cuba, it was also Kennedy's restraint that kept the world from war. In the following months, Khrushchev received heavy criticism from members of the Politburo for his decision to compromise with the United States, criticism that eventually led to his resignation. In the end, the Cuban Missile Crisis tested the wills of the two largest superpowers, and as a result, brought the world to near destruction. The peaceful resolution was only made possible through the willingness of Kennedy and Khrushchev to compromise.